Hello, this is John Aker, call sign Nomad. This is my YouTube channel. The top line of the splash screen is their YouTube is calling a handle, part of the URL to find this channel, youtube.com/@ John Aker, aviating author. And note the dots, the periods between the last four words. That forms the handle. This introduction is the first of more than a dozen videos that I generated that follow my autobiography, recollections, my life in and out of the military. And they will represent planes I flew during the 18 years of active flying status I was on during my 20-year military career as a United States Air Force pilot. I found software that runs in the computer flight simulator world, matching airplanes that I flew in real life. And I narrate them with a narrative stream of consciousness, stories of what was happening in my life during the times when I flew those airplanes. And, well, they're war stories, you know, of course. And in war stories, you have to be careful because the first liar ain't got a chance. You'll learn a little bit about computer flight simulators and videos, the equipment I use to get it done, and we'll have some fun. And check your six back there. I might be on your tail. Nomad is back. Let's take a look at the rest of this series. This is the fourth in the of the series in the 135 airframe. It's the RC135D model, a SIGINT, Signals Intelligence Collector. Flew mostly from out of Eielson against the Russian coast in the Arctic, from the Bering Sea to the Barents Sea in the far west. Also a tour out of Kadena, Southeast Asia, flying in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is John Aker coming to you again, call sign Nomad. We're still at Fairchild Air Force Base outside of Spokane, Washington. And this is the fourth in the series of KC-135 videos. KC-135 was not number 9 on my list. So we're at Fairchild. We've been here for a while. Our son was born here. And now I've gotten orders. I'm headed for Alaska to fly the same airframe, but reconnaissance versions of the 135. And first I've got to head to Castle Air Force Base. So while we're here, I thought we'd get airborne from Fairchild in the old 135. See what's going on around the world and continue the stories of what was happening to me on and off of the airplanes. So let's get her airborne. Under knots. And again, this is in Flight Simulator 10, FSX, and the scenery is relatively sparse. Rotate. to gear up. And clean the flaps up. And let's push back from the old girl so we can see a little bit more scenery around the place. I just thought I'd head west out of Fairchild over towards the Seattle area, because that's where part of the tail picks up. I left my wife and the 3 children, Fairchild, headed down to Castle for another round of training. And met a fellow who was to be my across the court neighbor in Alaska, and we flew together for most of the training flights, learned how to refuel. We basically flew, I believe they've changed the designation so often I had trouble tracing it down, but I think we flew the KC-135R, R as in Romeo, which was basically just like this airplane, an A model, the old J57 engines. And they added a receptacle. Pause her here for a minute. The receptacle was right about here, just beyond the eyebrow windows, center line on the top of the fuselage. And let's unpause. And headed up to about 10,000 feet. I think that'll get us over the mountains, which is, I believe, called the Cascade Range. And that's not really, I think, we drove over to Seattle while we were at Spokane. And there's Snoqualmie Pass is on the road highway over there. And while we were there, I just pushed the power up a little bit. Looks like he's got a little water left in it. While we were in Spokane, the whole family went to the top of the Space Needle, left over from a World's Fair. We had dinner in the rotating restaurant up there. I think it revolved at 1 revolution per hour. So if you got to spend an hour eating lunch, you saw the same rotation all the way around. Yeah, let's get in here and see if we can set us on that autopilot. Set an altitude of 10,000 feet. And it takes it a minute to take over, and there she goes. We're climbing. Oh, you probably don't want to climb that. 1,000 feet a minute's good. That'll take us up to 10,000 feet. So I took off for Castle in my car, drove down there, met my neighbor to be.
Our instructor was rumored to be a fellow who had been with the Our Gang group in the Our Gang comedy movies way back in the day. He was good. I'll never forget my first time in the seat. There it was. Taker's out here somewhere, and I'm coming up behind him, and I just start a little over controlling on ailerons, and I'm swinging. Taker's not moving, but in my windscreen, he's going from here to here, and finally the instructor said, "You don't have to stop right behind him, just stop somewhere." And I did, and after that it was pretty much level flight, downhill, getting easier as the rides went on. So we finished up there. We got a check ride with somebody other than our instructor, and we had to, the navigator would rendezvous with the tanker for us, and each of the fellow I was going through with, we had to come in from about a mile and a half after the tanker, stabilize in the contact position, go through all the procedures, hold it steady in the contact, get a boom contact, and hold that for a minimum of 5 minutes. And we both passed that. Yeah, 9,500 coming up on 10,000 feet. Okay, I finished that, and I drive back up to Fairchild, pick up Pat and our children, 2 daughters and our son, and we head back over to Seattle. And in Seattle, we dropped off the car somewhere because they were going to ship it by ship. And it was going to take way longer than our flight to Alaska. And we're level at 10,000 feet. Dropped the car off, headed from McCord Air Force Base, a little south of Seattle at Tacoma, where we're going to pick up our transport to Alaska. And I remember I had the job of counting pieces of baggage for the whole trip out of Fairchild over to the Seattle area, onto the airplane to Alaska. We had 17 items for the 5 of us. Of course, that included Barbie suitcases and a Hot Wheels suitcase for our son. When we got to Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, our flight was, I may have been mistaken about McCord. Our flight, I left out of McCord on another assignment. I think we left out of SeaTac, Seattle, on Alaska Airways to Fairbanks, Alaska. Yeah, you get a little clearer turbulence there. Look at the wings rock on her. Got to Fairbanks, there was no base housing available, as we figured. So we found an apartment in Fairbanks. They were a group of buildings, 2-story buildings, 4 apartments per building. The lower floor was were daylight basement apartments. That is, they were only half above ground, and we got one of those, which was okay. We had a window that showed the outside, but a little later on it wasn't quite okay. Middle of the night, 3 or 4 in the morning, a 7.0 earthquake hit just south of Fairbanks. Fortunately, it only lasted about 30 seconds. Otherwise, the damage would have been horrendous. We survived that. I woke up and we had some furniture on loan from base housing, and I watched a mirror I had sitting on top of a dresser do what I call a 1.5 gainer off the top and land flat on the floor and shatter into 1,000 pieces. Went to the front door and ushered the kids out to get outside the building. I'm in my skivvies saying, hey, good morning to the neighbors in the other basement apartment in that building. And then one afternoon I was at the base flight planning and Pat called and said, better come home. Water seems to be coming up around here. So I took off for town, got within maybe almost a mile, that close to the apartment, and didn't see a doggone thing. I didn't see any water coming up. Well, it was creeping up. And it got to the point where we were hauling stuff up to a friend's apartment. They were on the second floor. They were going to sweat it out. We knew we couldn't. And I have a picture of us, a guy in a rowboat, hauling me and my family out to the parking lot where I left the car. Fortunately, it was high and dry still. I asked the fellow what he was doing, why he was out helping people. He says, well, my house is right down on the riverbank. And last time I saw it, it was up to the eaves. Water went 5 feet deep above ground in that neighborhood where we got out. And with that, we went into visiting officers' quarters. Stayed there 30 days, and the young lieutenant running that place says, well, you have to move out now. 30 days is the limit. And I said, well, where would you suggest we go, young man? He didn't have any ideas. I said, well, here's what you can do. Once you sign us out today, and you sign us back in tomorrow, and we'll just stay here overnight. He wasn't real happy with my idea, but that's what he did. And we did get housing within about a couple of weeks. And that was a 2-bedroom, and within a week or so a 4-bedroom came up, which we were entitled to. So we moved again, and that was early December. And it's 20 below. It's 20 below Alaska. Walked to work one morning because I knew the car wouldn't start. 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, true temperature, no wind chill. That's right, nippy. Yeah, we're still westbound towards Seattle, and I'm already talking about being in Alaska, so the problem I've got here with this series of flights is I can find no flight simulator models of the RC135 aircraft. So we're going to have to do with some stills. I'm going to pause here and bring out a picture of a 135, RC135D model. D is in dog. Still the same old J57 engines. No upgrades there. And you notice some weird bumps here and there. Extra antenna. and what we called the thimble nose. Got so you could recognize different recce models of airplanes by the shape of their antennas. This is a D model. Only 3 existed, and our 24th Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron at Eielson Air Force Base owned all 3. We owned 2 other aircraft, and I flew one of those. We'll get to it a little bit. You see, she's still burning water to get off the ground. And the D model was a typical KC-135, and back in those days was on the books at about $5 million a piece. This is the cheapest one of the 5 airplanes we owned. The D model was in the neighborhood of $40 million with all the internal additions to her. There was still a boom pod back here, but there was no boom. So where did we fly these airplanes? Okay, you guys, there's Eielson Air Force Base is right here in about the middle of Alaska. From here, we'd short flights into these areas. Here we could fly unrefueled. If we were headed further, we'd drag a tanker with us, and we'd refuel from them out here. The whole thing was radio silent. We'd drop him off, and we'd head on either the East Siberian Sea, the Laptev Sea, Kara Sea down here behind Novaya Zemlya, and the Barents Sea. And if we were covering these areas out through here, we typically would exit out, come down the coast of Norway, headed for the United Kingdom. And while I was flying out of Alaska on these flights, in the UK we landed at RAF Upper Heyford, which was about 20 miles from Oxford. And it worked out just fine. We'd hit the ground, and if we didn't have any major maintenance problems to write up, we could debrief maintenance and mission, hit the BOQ, change clothes, and make it to the train station at Bicester North for the last train to London that night. Typically we'd hear it here on a Friday, and we'd spend Friday and Saturday in London, come back to the base Sunday or Monday, depending on when we had to fly out. So we'll see a map similar to this a little later on. So we were out here chugging along 50 miles off the Russian coast. Droning along for hours. These missions lasted over here probably 9 or 10 hours. The ones going clear across the top were probably 13, 14-hour missions. Also, while I was there, and this looks familiar, doesn't it? The 82nd Air Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron at Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, flew missions down against targets in Southeast Asia. And their planes were going through Iran. First time I heard that term, I said, why are they sending our airplanes clear over to the Mideast? And so I said, no, dummy, that stands for inspect and repair as necessary. So I got past that. They were shorthanded on the M models. The M models had fan engines, and they could refuel. at level flight. We couldn't. The first thing I told them was, in these temperatures, and this was summertime, I was going to have a refueling block 5,000 feet in order. When we hit our first tanker off the southern tip of Taiwan, coming after takeoff, we were taking it up to max weight in the air, and I knew I couldn't stay in the air. And they kept asking why, and I said, because you guys are used to fan engine airplanes, and I ain't got no fans. I said, you want to schedule me on a flight, we'll go out there and see how long I can stay in the air at level flight before I just stall out and fall off the boom. And they didn't want to do it because it was work for the staff, but they got me a 5,000 foot altitude block. The only problem with these missions was we'd come down here, swing into the Gulf of Tonkin, and we'd sit here on orbit just about 50 miles off Haiphong Harbor. And after several hours, we'd come down here, and they had two more tankers down here, because it was going to take 3 tankers to keep us airborne for 19 hours, which is what we were flying, 19 and a half hour missions. So we'd hit a tanker southbound in the orbit, drop off, swing around, hit the other tanker going northbound, they'd head for home, and we'd come back up here for another 6 or 8 hours in our orbit. And I had a copilot I was teaching to how to refuel. He didn't have too much time on a boom. We came down here, came up on the first tanker, and I let him go, and he's chasing it around the sky, and I'm coaching him, and he's doing a good job. He's just like all of us were when we were new, chase that thing all over the sky. And finally, we're getting close to the end of the refueling track, and Nad's warning me, and I'm saying, yeah, okay. So I took control of the airplane, and I came up and got a contact with the tanker heading southbound. And it happened to be a fellow I knew who met him at pre-brief before takeoff, and it was a fellow I knew from back at Fairchild. So he gives me a call, and he says, you know, we're coming up on the end of track, in the refueling track. And I says, yeah, Jack, I know. I says, I won't tell if you won't tell. He said, Roger, rolling into a 30-degree bank now. We weren't supposed to refuel in turns, but it was the only way we were going to get both tankers within the allotted time. So he eased it into a gentle 30-degree bank turn with the autopilot, and I stuck on the boom around the turn. And we had our offloading by the time we were rolled out northbound. I dropped off him and went after the second tanker, refueled. So the crews in general will get the job done despite the staff. I got an award while we were down there at Kadena. It wasn't a big fancy medal. It wasn't a big fancy plaque for the wall. It was a little hand-drawn thing, and matter of fact, I can see it sitting on a bookcase from where I'm sitting right now. Back in those days, there was a TV show called F Troop, and Forrest Tucker was one of the stars. And it was about the cavalry, back in the cavalry days, Indian fighting and all that. And this maintenance team had nicknamed themselves F Troop, and they were working on my D model along with the M models, and I was adopted as an honorary member of F Troop. It's one of those things all that you cherish more than all the fancy gewgaws they can hand you in a career. So this is back in the old KC. We're still headed westbound out of Fairchild, and we talked about the D model, nicknamed Rivet Brass. And here we are back looking at an image we saw earlier. This is the RC135D. We had three of them, only three in existence. Tail numbers 356, 357, and 362, if I remember correctly. Being in an operational reconnaissance squadron, you seldom got training missions. We flew, virtually every mission we flew was an operational higher headquarters directed classified mission. And on training missions, we did get occasionally, in addition to our annual check ride. And I remember one flight with the wing ops officer came along, full colonel, and he wanted to refuel in practice. A little scary. He was a little on the shaky side because he didn't get much flying time. So he climbed into the left seat. Since I was not an instructor pilot, I technically wasn't supposed to be in the right seat. So I left my co-pilot in the right seat. I sat in the jump seat, and the colonel went in for the refuel, and he got in fairly good, but he got distracted or something, and we were closing way too fast on that tanker, moving in on him. And I was reaching up between the two of them for the throttles when my co-pilot reached over and jerked the throttles back. I had a sharp co-pilot. And we got back into the traffic pattern, and again we weren't supposed to shoot more than really not more than one landing per flight, but we were going to squeeze in two. The colonel needed a landing and my co-pilot needed a landing. So we did three full stops and take three full stops. First landing was the colonel. Yeah, it wasn't too bad. Next, my co-pilot came around the traffic pattern. He put it on the ground pretty smooth. And for takeoff, I got back in the left seat, made the takeoff, flew the traffic pattern, came back in. And I knew I couldn't do anything but hand him a perfect landing. Fortunately, we had 13,000 feet in front of us, so I used a trick for smooth landings that you don't usually use because you burn up too much runway behind you getting it on the ground. But I held her off and eased her on, and she kissed onto the concrete. A couple of days later, my squadron commander asked the colonel, he says, how'd that flight with that crew go? And the colonel says, he did give us credit. He says, oh, it went okay. Those other two pilots got a better landing than I did. So this is RC135D rivet brass, a SIGINT airplane, signals intelligence. And I got to give it to my guys in the back end. I just flew the airplane where the navigator told me to go. But the guys in the back end did all the spooky work. And on one mission, they captured a Russian radar that had never been logged on before. In fact, they built special airplanes looking for that radar. And my guys in the back got her. So that wraps up our first part of our time in Alaska with the D model, and I'm going to split the coverage here, and we'll come back and take a look at an RC135S Sierra rivet ball in the next one. So Nomad says keep your head on that swivel, keep your eyes on your six, and I'll be back shortly.
If you enjoyed some of this material, you might reach up there and click that like button. Want to come back, hit the subscribe to this channel. This is John Aker, call sign Nomad, flying flight simulators based on my career as a U.S. Air Force pilot.
skies.